The morning I found out there was a restraining order against me, I was standing in my kitchen making pancakes for my 8-year-old daughter Emma, humming along to the radio like any other Tuesday. The batter was perfect, golden and smooth, the way Emma liked it, and I had just poured the first circle onto the griddle when the doorbell rang. 3 sharp official knocks followed. I wiped my hands on my apron, thinking it might be a delivery or maybe Mrs. Henderson from next door with another story about her cat. Instead, I opened the door to find a sheriff's deputy holding a manila envelope, his expression neutral but somehow apologetic. "Sarah Mitchell?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, that's me," I replied, glancing back toward the kitchen where Emma was setting the table with her usual careful precision, tongue poking out in concentration. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You've been served," the deputy said, pressing the envelope into my hands. "Court date's on the front. Have a good day, ma'am." I stood there in my doorway, still in my pajamas and flour-dusted apron, watching his patrol car pull away from my suburban driveway. The envelope felt heavy, official, wrong. Emma called from the kitchen that the pancakes were burning, and I rushed back, sliding the envelope onto the counter as I flipped the now-blackened pancake. My hands were shaking, though I couldn't understand why. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just making breakfast for my daughter on a Tuesday morning in September. But as I opened that envelope and read the words "emergency restraining order" and saw my husband David's signature at the bottom, along with accusations that made my stomach turn, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life was about to crumble. The woman described in those legal papers wasn't me. She was violent, unstable, a danger to her own child. She was someone I didn't recognize, someone I would cross the street to avoid. Yet there was my name at the top of every page, my address, my daughter's name listed as someone who needed protection from me. The pancake smoke alarm started shrieking, and Emma covered her ears, looking at me with those wide brown eyes that were so much like mine. "Mommy, what's wrong?" she asked over the noise, and I realized I was just standing there, papers scattered around me on the kitchen floor where I'd apparently dropped them. I turned off the burner, fanned the smoke detector until it stopped wailing, and knelt down to gather the legal documents that were somehow supposed to prove I was an unfit mother. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," I lied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Just burned breakfast a little. How about we have cereal instead?" But everything was wrong. According to these papers filed just yesterday, I had been physically abusive to my husband David during our recent separation. I had threatened him and his girlfriend, someone named Jessica Chen. I had exhibited erratic behavior that endangered our daughter. I was apparently so dangerous that I wasn't allowed within 500 feet of David, Jessica, or David's workplace at Morrison & Associates law firm downtown. The most devastating part was buried in the middle of the second page. Temporary custody of Emma was being awarded to David, effective immediately, until a hearing could determine whether supervised visitation would be appropriate for me. I read that line 3 times before it sank in. They were taking my daughter away from me, based on lies, based on a story I didn't even recognize as having any connection to reality. I managed to hold myself together long enough to get Emma dressed and ready for school, chattering with her about her upcoming spelling test and whether she wanted turkey or peanut butter in her lunch. Normal mom things, safe things, things that proved I wasn't the monster described in those papers. As I braided her hair, my fingers moved automatically through the familiar routine, while my mind raced. When had David filed this? Why hadn't he said anything when he picked Emma up for his weekend just 3 days ago? How could he look me in the eye and take our daughter's hand, knowing he was planning this? After I dropped Emma at Lincoln Elementary, waving goodbye like everything was normal, I sat in my car in the parking lot and finally let myself fall apart. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere so deep I didn't know that place existed inside me. Other parents walked past my Honda, probably thinking I was having some kind of breakdown, which I suppose I was. But not the kind described in David's legal filing. This was the breakdown of a woman who had just discovered that the man she'd loved for 12 years, the father of her child, was capable of weaponizing the legal system against her with surgical precision. My phone buzzed with a text message from my sister Rachel, "Coffee later, need sister time." I stared at the message, wondering how to explain that I might not be allowed to have sister time anymore, that I might not be allowed to have any kind of normal life anymore. Instead, I texted back, "Can't today, call you later." Then I drove home to figure out how to prove I wasn't a person I'd never been. The house felt different when I walked back in, like it was already mourning the loss of Emma's presence. Her backpack hook was empty, her shoes weren't scattered by the front door. The breakfast dishes sat in the sink, a physical reminder of how quickly everything could change. I spread the restraining order papers across my dining room table, the same table where Emma and I did homework every evening, where we played board games on rainy Saturday afternoons, where just last week we'd carved pumpkins for Halloween. According to David's sworn statement, I had become increasingly unstable following our separation in June. He claimed I had thrown dishes at him during an argument about custody arrangements. He said I had called his workplace repeatedly, disrupting his meetings and embarrassing him in front of colleagues. He alleged that I had followed him to restaurants and confronted him and Jessica in public, causing scenes that frightened other patrons. Most damaging of all, he claimed that Emma had started exhibiting signs of anxiety and fear around me, asking to spend more time at his apartment. Every single allegation was either a complete fabrication or a twisted version of something innocent. Yes, a plate had broken during our last big argument, but it had slipped from my hands while I was cleaning up dinner, not thrown in anger. Yes, I had called his office, exactly twice, to discuss Emma's school schedule and a parent-teacher conference. Yes, I had run into him and Jessica at Romano's restaurant 3 weeks ago, but only because it was the same place Emma and I went for pizza every Friday. The awkward conversation that followed had lasted maybe 5 minutes, with me being politely distant and Jessica looking uncomfortable. As for Emma showing fear around me, that was perhaps the cruelest lie of all. Emma was my shadow, my little companion, my best friend. She crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, insisted I read her the same 3 books every night, and still held my hand when we walked through parking lots. The idea that she was afraid of me wasn't just false, it was designed to destroy me from the inside out. I called my lawyer, Patricia Gonzalez, who had handled my divorce paperwork over the summer. Her receptionist put me through immediately, probably hearing the panic in my voice when I said it was an emergency. "Sarah, what's happened?" Patricia asked, and I could hear her fingers already moving across her keyboard, ready to take notes. "David filed a restraining order against me," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "And he's trying to take Emma away." There was a pause, then the sound of Patricia's chair creaking as she sat forward. "I need you to scan and email me everything right now," she said. "Don't talk to anyone else about this, don't post anything on social media, don't even text your sister about it yet. This is serious, Sarah." Emergency restraining orders are usually granted based on immediate danger, and family court judges don't mess around when children are involved. I spent the next hour scanning documents and sending them to Patricia, my hands steadier now that I had something concrete to do. Action felt better than helplessness, even if the action was just feeding papers into a machine. While I waited for her to review everything, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen counter, trying to understand how my life had taken this turn. David and I had met in college, both of us studying at State University, though he was pre-law and I was getting my teaching degree. He had been charming then, confident in a way that drew people to him, including me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He played intramural soccer and wore button-down shirts even to casual parties, always looking like he was ready for a job interview or a photo shoot. I fell for his ambition, his 5-year plans, his certainty about what he wanted from life. I thought his decisiveness was strength. I didn't recognize it as control until much later. We married right after graduation, a small ceremony in my parents' backyard that my mother still talked about as the most beautiful wedding she'd ever attended. David started law school while I began teaching 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary. Those early years were good ones, or at least I remembered them as good. We had routines, shared goals, a sense that we were building something together. When Emma was born 6 years later, I felt like our family was complete. But David's ambition never slowed down. Law school became a junior associate position at Morrison and Associates. Junior associate became senior associate. The hours got longer, the stress levels higher, and somehow I became responsible for managing everything else: Emma's schedule, the household, the social obligations, the emotional labor of maintaining relationships with both sets of parents. David provided financially, and I provided everything else. The cracks started showing about 2 years ago, though I didn't recognize them as cracks at the time. David began working even later, missing Emma's soccer games and school concerts. When I mentioned feeling like a single parent, he reminded me that his salary afforded me the luxury of part-time teaching. When I suggested we needed more family time, he explained the pressures of partnership track. Every concern I raised was met with a rational explanation that made me feel selfish for bringing it up. Then came Jessica Chen, though I didn't know her name until much later. She started as David's new paralegal last spring, a recent graduate from the local community college, with what David described as exceptional organizational skills and a strong work ethic. He mentioned her occasionally in the context of cases they were working on together, always professionally, always appropriately. I had no reason to be suspicious, and honestly I was too busy managing my own teaching load and Emma's increasingly complex schedule to pay much attention to David's work relationships. The signs I missed were subtle at first. David showering as soon as he came home, when he used to collapse on the couch in his work clothes. New cologne, though he claimed his old one had been discontinued. Working weekends at the office instead of bringing files home like he used to do. When I asked about the changes, he had reasonable explanations. The office was being renovated, so it was quieter there on weekends. He was trying to establish better work-life boundaries by keeping office work at the office. The new cologne had been a sample from somewhere, and he'd liked how it smelled. I wanted to believe him, so I did. It's amazing how willingly we accept explanations that allow us to avoid uncomfortable truths. Looking back, I think I knew something was wrong but couldn't bring myself to investigate further. I had a daughter to raise, a job to do, a life that felt manageable as long as I didn't look too closely at the foundation it was built on. The revelation came in May, not through detective work or dramatic confrontation, but through Emma's innocent observation. She was in the back seat of my car, as we drove past David's office building on a Saturday afternoon, heading to her friend's birthday party. "Daddy's working again," she said, pointing up at the windows. I looked up and saw David's silhouette in his office window, but he wasn't alone. There was a woman with long black hair, standing very close to him, and even from the street, even through the tinted glass, the intimacy of their posture was unmistakable. I didn't confront David immediately. Instead, I did what any reasonable person would do. I investigated. I started paying attention to details I'd been unconsciously ignoring. The late nights that coincided with Jessica's schedule, which I found by calling the office and asking the receptionist when David's paralegal worked. The weekend emergency meetings that always seemed to involve just the two of them. The credit card charges at restaurants I'd never been to, always for two people, always during lunch hours when David claimed to be eating at his desk. When I finally found the smoking gun, it wasn't hidden or encrypted or particularly clever. It was a text message thread on David's phone while he was in the shower, his phone buzzing on the nightstand, with what he'd told me was a client emergency. The message preview showed Jessica's name, and the words "Can't wait to see you tonight. Wear that blue shirt I love." There were dozens of messages above it, months of intimate conversation, inside jokes, plans for romantic dinners, and weekend getaways that had been disguised as business trips. I scrolled through enough to understand the scope of what had been happening under my nose for nearly 8 months. This wasn't a fling or a moment of weakness. This was a full relationship, complete with pet names, future plans, and detailed discussions about when David would leave his marriage. Jessica knew about me, knew about Emma, knew that she was participating in the destruction of a family. The messages made it clear that she was impatient with David's timeline, pushing him to file for divorce sooner rather than later. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal, though that was crushing. It was the casual cruelty of how they discussed me. I was the wife or her, or sometimes just says, they made jokes about my appearance, my personality, my parenting. Jessica had apparently met Emma during one of David's custody weekends, and their text thread included her observations about how shy and clingy Emma was, how she needed more structure and discipline. They were discussing my daughter like she was a problem to be solved, a complication in their romance. I confronted David that night, after Emma went to bed, phone in hand, evidence undeniable. I expected anger, denial, maybe even remorse. What I got was relief. He seemed almost glad to be caught, like he'd been waiting for someone else to make the decision he'd been avoiding. "I didn't want it to happen this way," he said, sitting on the edge of our bed while I paced around the room. "But Sarah, you have to know we haven't been happy for years. We could have tried counseling," I said, though even as the words came out, I knew they sounded hollow. "We could have worked on things." David shook his head, already mentally checked out of the conversation, maybe out of our marriage entirely. "Some things can't be fixed," he said. "I love Jessica, I want to be with her, I want Emma to have a stable home environment." That last part stopped me cold. Emma has a stable home environment. This is her home, I'm her mother. David's expression shifted then, becoming the same clinical strategic look he wore when preparing for court cases. "Emma spends half her time confused about why mommy and daddy don't laugh anymore, why we sleep in separate bedrooms, why there's always tension in the house. She deserves better than that." I realized then that David had already been planning this conversation, maybe for weeks. He had his talking points prepared, his justifications lined up, his vision for how this would all work out. In his mind, he would move in with Jessica, Emma would split time between households, and eventually we'd all adjust to the new normal. He made it sound reasonable, inevitable, almost kind. We separated that week. David moved into a furnished apartment downtown, close to his office and presumably close to Jessica, though he never confirmed that directly. Emma took the news better than I expected, with the resilience that kids often show in the face of adult disasters. She asked practical questions. Where would Daddy sleep? Could she decorate his new room? Would they still have movie nights together? I answered as honestly as I could, while protecting her from the uglier details. The summer was a blur of logistics and adjustment. Emma spent weeknights with me and weekends with David, a schedule that felt artificial but manageable. I threw myself into summer school teaching and tried to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. I started running again, something I hadn't done since college. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during the years when David's career had consumed our social calendar. I even went on a few dates, awkward coffee meetings arranged by well-meaning friends who thought I needed to get back out there. David was professionally cordial during our interactions, treating me like a business partner in the project of co-parenting Emma. He was punctual for pickups and drop-offs, communicated about school events and medical appointments, and never said anything obviously unkind. But there was a distance there that felt deliberate, like he was already practicing for the life where I would be just Emma's other parent, not someone he'd once promised to love forever. I should have seen the restraining order coming, but I was so focused on building stability for Emma and myself that I missed the signs. The first hint came in late August, when Emma mentioned that Jessica had made dinner for them at Daddy's apartment, and it had been really good. When I asked Emma how often Jessica was there during her weekend visits, Emma shrugged and said usually. I felt a spike of something: jealousy, protectiveness, territorial anger, but I swallowed it and asked Emma if she liked Jessica. "She's nice," Emma said in the neutral tone children use when they're trying not to hurt anyone's feelings. "She lets me help cook, and she has a really soft cat named Muffin, but she doesn't know how to braid hair very well, and she thinks I'm too old for some of my stuffed animals." I made a mental note to ask David about introducing Emma to Jessica without discussing it with me first, but I didn't want to create conflict that might affect Emma's relationship with her father. The second hint came when David started pushing for modifications to our custody arrangement. He wanted Emma for an extra weeknight each week, arguing that she needed more stability and routine, which was apparently easier to provide at his apartment than at our house. When I pointed out that our house was Emma's primary residence, where all her things were, where she'd lived her entire life, David suggested that might be part of the problem. Emma needed to adjust to her new reality, he said, and spending too much time in the old family home might be preventing that adjustment. I agreed to one extra evening per week, thinking it was reasonable to be flexible during this transition period. But then David asked for alternating weeks instead of the current schedule. Then he suggested that Emma might benefit from attending school from his apartment, since it was in a better district. Each request came with logical reasons and Emma's best interests at heart, but something about the pattern felt strategic rather than spontaneous. The third hint was so subtle I almost missed it entirely. During one of our custody exchanges, David asked me how I was handling the stress of the separation, whether I was getting enough sleep, whether I might benefit from talking to someone professional. His tone was concerned, caring even, and I appreciated what seemed like genuine worry about my well-being. I told him I was managing fine, that I had been talking to friends and staying active, that Emma and I were finding our new rhythm together. But later, as I was driving home, something about the conversation bothered me. The way David had phrased his questions, the specific details he'd asked about, felt more like information gathering than caring inquiry. How was my sleep? Was I experiencing mood swings? Had I been more emotional than usual? Had Emma mentioned anything about me seeming upset or overwhelmed? The questions felt clinical, purposeful, like items on a checklist rather than expressions of genuine concern. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia brought on by the stress of divorce proceedings, but I couldn't completely shake the sense that David was building a case for something. I just had no idea what that case might be, or how devastating it would prove to be. The morning I was served with the restraining order, Patricia called me back after reviewing all the documents. Her voice was grim in a way that made my stomach clench before she even started talking. "Sarah, this is worse than I initially thought," she said. "David hasn't just filed for a restraining order, he's filed for emergency custody modification based on allegations of domestic violence and child endangerment. If these allegations are upheld, you could lose Emma permanently." I sank into my kitchen chair, the same one where I'd been sitting when David first asked me to marry him 9 years ago, back when the future had seemed bright and certain. "But none of it's true," I said, though my voice sounded weak even to me. "Patricia, you know me. You've met Emma. Does any of this sound like something I would do?" "Of course not," Patricia said immediately. "But family court doesn't operate on personal character references. It operates on evidence documentation and legal procedure. David has presented what appears to be a carefully constructed case against you, complete with dates, witnesses, and supporting documentation. We need to deconstruct it piece by piece, and we need to do it fast. The emergency hearing is scheduled for next Monday. Next Monday, 4 days to prove I wasn't a violent, unstable mother who posed a danger to my own child. 4 days to figure out how someone I'd loved and trusted for 12 years had managed to twist our shared history into evidence of my unfitness as a parent. 4 days to understand how the man who used to call me the best mother he knew was now arguing in legal documents that Emma would be safer without me. I hung up with Patricia and walked through my house, seeing it through the lens of David's allegations. The broken plate he'd mentioned was long gone, swept up and thrown away the night it happened, but I could see how the argument that led to its breaking might be reconstructed as evidence of violent tendencies. The calls to his office could be reframed as harassment rather than co-parenting communication. Even my surprise encounter with David and Jessica at Romano's could be presented as stalking behavior if you ignored the innocent explanation. What terrified me most was how plausible it all sounded when presented through David's legal expertise. He knew how to build cases, how to present facts in the most damaging light possible, how to create compelling narratives from scattered pieces of evidence. I was a third-grade teacher who'd been out of the dating world for over a decade. I knew how to help 8-year-olds with multiplication tables and playground conflicts, not how to defend myself against legal accusations that could cost me everything that mattered. That evening, I had to tell Emma about the temporary custody change, though I tried to frame it as positively as possible. "Daddy wants you to stay with him for a little while," I said, sitting on her bed while she organized her stuffed animals for the 10th time that day. "Just until some grown-up stuff gets sorted out." Emma looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that seemed too old for her 8-year-old face. "Is it because you and Daddy are getting divorced?" she asked. "Sort of," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. But nothing about this changes how much I love you or how proud I am to be your mom. We're just going to have a different schedule for a little while." Emma nodded and went back to arranging her stuffed animals, but I could see the worry in the tense line of her shoulders, the way she held her favorite bear just a little tighter. David came to pick up Emma and her things an hour later, bringing Jessica with him to help carry Emma's suitcases and boxes. It was the first time I'd seen Jessica up close, and I was struck by how young she looked, maybe mid-20s, with glossy black hair, and the kind of polished appearance that comes from having time and money to invest in self-care. She was polite but distant, staying in the background while David talked to Emma about what toys she wanted to bring to his apartment. "This is temporary," David said to me while Emma ran upstairs to get her favorite blanket. "Once everything gets sorted out, we can work out a more permanent arrangement." But something in his tone suggested he'd already decided what that permanent arrangement would look like, and I wasn't going to like it. After they left, taking Emma and what felt like half the contents of our house, I sat in the sudden quiet and tried to understand what had just happened to my life. 12 hours ago, I had been a single mother adjusting to divorce but confident in my relationship with my daughter. Now I was a woman accused of domestic violence, separated from her child, facing the possibility that a judge might decide I was too dangerous to be trusted with unsupervised visitation. I called my sister Rachel and told her everything, breaking my lawyer's advice about not discussing the case, but needing someone to remind me that I wasn't losing my mind. Rachel listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or anger. When I finished, she was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Sarah," she finally said, "I've known you my entire life. I've seen you cry over stepping on ants by accident. You once drove 30 miles out of your way to take an injured bird to a wildlife rehabilitation center. The idea that you would hurt David or Emma or anyone else is not just false, it's absurd." Her voice got stronger as she talked. "This is manipulation, pure and simple. David is using the legal system to control you, and we're not going to let him get away with it." Rachel's confidence gave me strength, but it also highlighted how isolated I felt. She lived 3 states away, and most of our mutual friends were really David's friends from work or law school. My teaching colleagues were supportive but distant, unwilling to get involved in personal drama that might reflect poorly on the school. Emma's friends' parents were friendly but cautious, probably unsure what to believe about the rumors that were undoubtedly starting to circulate. I spent the next 3 days preparing for the emergency hearing with Patricia, going through every interaction I'd had with David since our separation, trying to find evidence that would contradict his allegations. We gathered character references from my principal, Emma's pediatrician, neighbors who'd witnessed my interactions with Emma. We documented my teaching record, my volunteer work at Emma's school, my complete lack of any history of violence or instability. But even as we built our case, I could see the challenge we faced. David's allegations were specific and detailed, supported by dates and times that would be difficult to disprove. My defense was essentially "I'm not that kind of person," which felt frustratingly abstract compared to his concrete accusations. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that something didn't happen when someone is claiming it did? The night before the hearing, I lay awake in Emma's empty bedroom, surrounded by the stuffed animals she'd left behind, trying to prepare myself for the possibility that I might lose her entirely. I thought about all the bedtime stories I might never read again, all the school events I might be forbidden from attending, all the ordinary moments of motherhood that I'd taken for granted and might never have again. I also thought about David, trying to understand how the man who'd once loved me enough to propose marriage, who'd held my hand during Emma's birth, who'd taken thousands of pictures of our family over the years, could now be working so systematically to destroy me. Was this revenge for discovering his affair, a way to assuage his guilt by reframing me as the villain in our marriage's end, or had he always been capable of this kind of calculated cruelty, and I'd just never been in a position to see it before? As dawn broke over my quiet house, I realized that regardless of David's motivations, I was about to walk into a courtroom where a stranger would decide whether I was fit to be a mother to my own child. Everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, everything that mattered most to me, would be reduced to legal arguments and evidence submissions. The stakes couldn't be higher, and I had no idea whether the truth would be enough to save me. But I did know one thing: I wasn't going to give up without a fight. Emma was my daughter, and I was her mother, and no amount of legal maneuvering was going to change that fundamental truth. David might have the advantage of legal training and careful planning, but I had 8 years of loving Emma with everything I had, and that had to count for something. I got up, showered, and put on the conservative navy suit Patricia had recommended for court. I looked at myself in the mirror and practiced the calm, confident expression she'd coached me to maintain, regardless of what happened during the hearing. I wasn't just Sarah Mitchell, the woman whose life was falling apart. I was Emma's mother, and I was going to fight for her like my life depended on it, because it did. The family courthouse smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I sat in the hallway outside Judge Martinez's courtroom, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking, watching David pace near the water fountain while talking quietly on his phone. He looked confident, relaxed even, like a man who knew exactly how this day was going to unfold. Jessica sat on a bench nearby, scrolling through her phone with the casual air of someone attending a routine appointment, rather than a hearing that could destroy a family. Patricia squeezed my shoulder as she settled into the chair beside me. "Remember what we practiced," she murmured. "Answer only what's asked, keep your voice steady, and don't let them see you react to whatever lies they tell in there." I nodded, though my throat felt so tight I wasn't sure I'd be able to speak at all when the time came. When the bailiff called our case, I walked into that courtroom feeling like I was entering a gladiator arena. Judge Martinez was a stern-looking woman in her 50s with steel gray hair, and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd heard every sob story and legal manipulation in the book. She didn't look up as we took our places at opposing tables, David and his attorney Thomas Brennan on one side, Patricia and me on the other. "This is an emergency hearing, regarding temporary custody modification in the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell," Judge Martinez announced, finally looking up from her paperwork. "Mr. Brennan, you filed the petition. Present your case." Thomas Brennan was everything I'd expected from one of David's law firm colleagues. Expensive suit, perfectly styled silver hair, the kind of smooth courtroom manner that probably impressed juries but felt slick and rehearsed to me. He stood up with a thick folder of documents and began painting a picture of me that was so far from reality it felt like listening to someone describe a stranger. According to Brennan's presentation, I had become increasingly unstable following our separation. He described the broken plate incident as me hurling dinnerware in a violent rage during an argument about custody arrangements. My phone calls to David's office became repeated harassment of Mr. Mitchell's workplace, disrupting his professional duties and embarrassing him in front of clients and colleagues. The encounter at Romano's restaurant was reframed as stalking behavior, with Mrs. Mitchell following Mr. Mitchell and Miss Chen to intimidate and confront them in public. But the most devastating testimony came when Brennan called David to the witness stand. My husband of 12 years, the man who'd once told me I was the strongest person he knew, sat in that chair and systematically destroyed my reputation as both a wife and mother. His voice was steady, professional, tinged with just the right amount of reluctance, as if he hated having to reveal these painful truths, but was doing so for Emma's safety. Mrs. Mitchell's behavior became increasingly erratic after I moved out, David testified, not once looking in my direction. She would call me multiple times a day, sometimes crying, sometimes angry. She accused me of turning Emma against her, which wasn't true. Emma started asking if she could spend more time at my apartment because the tension at home was making her anxious. I wanted to scream. Emma had never said anything about preferring David's apartment. She missed her own room, her toys, the neighbor's dog she liked to pet through the fence. But David continued, describing a version of our daughter that I didn't recognize, a child supposedly stressed and frightened by her mother's emotional instability. "The incident that concerned me most," David said, his voice dropping to convey appropriate gravity, "occurred 3 weeks ago when I went to pick up Emma for my weekend. Sarah was clearly agitated about something, pacing around the kitchen, muttering under her breath. When I asked if everything was okay, she exploded. She started screaming at me about how I'd ruined her life, how I was trying to steal Emma away from her. Emma was right there, watching this whole thing, and she started crying. This was a complete fabrication. 3 weeks ago, David had been late for pickup, and I'd been stressed because Emma had been waiting by the window for an hour asking where Daddy was. When David finally arrived, I'd asked him to call next time he was going to be delayed, and he'd snapped at me about being controlling. Emma had cried because she was disappointed about missing the beginning of a movie they'd planned to see, not because of anything I'd done. But sitting in that courtroom, listening to David's version with his attorney nodding sympathetically and taking notes, I could see how easily the truth could be twisted into something sinister. David had always been good with words, skilled at presenting arguments that sounded reasonable even when they weren't entirely accurate. Now he was using those same skills to destroy me. The worst part came when Brennan asked David about Emma's recent behavior. "She's been having nightmares," David testified. "She wakes up crying, asking if she has to go back to Mommy's house. Last weekend, she asked if she could live with me all the time. When I asked her why, she said Mommy gets too sad and it scares her. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood." Emma had never said anything remotely like that to David or anyone else. She loved our bedtime routine, our morning pancakes, our weekend adventures to the park or the library. The idea that she was afraid of my sadness or didn't want to come home was so fundamentally wrong that I wanted to jump up and demand proof, recording something concrete to support these horrible lies. But the most shocking moment came when Brennan called his next witness, Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist I'd never heard of. Dr. Foster testified that she'd been conducting sessions with Emma for the past month at David's request, evaluating her emotional state and adjustment to the family separation. "I've had 3 sessions with Emma," Dr. Foster said, consulting her notes. "She presents as a bright, articulate child who is clearly struggling with the family upheaval. She's expressed concern about her mother's emotional state, describing incidents where Mrs. Mitchell seemed really sad or mad about Daddy. Emma has also mentioned feeling responsible for her parents' problems, which is common in children of divorce, but concerning given the level of conflict she's witnessing." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. David had taken Emma to a therapist without telling me, without my consent, and was now using that therapist's testimony to support his case against me. I wanted to ask when these sessions had occurred, what questions Dr. Foster had asked Emma, whether she'd made any effort to contact me for my perspective on Emma's behavior. But I could only sit there and listen as a stranger described my daughter's supposed psychological state based on conversations I'd known nothing about. When Patricia cross-examined Dr. Foster, she pressed on several important points. "Dr. Foster, did you attempt to contact Mrs. Mitchell before beginning therapy with Emma?" The answer was no. "Did you request records from Emma's pediatrician or school counselor to establish a baseline for her emotional state?" Again no. "Are you aware that conducting therapy with a minor child without both parents' consent, except in cases of suspected abuse, may violate ethical guidelines?" Dr. Foster looked uncomfortable but maintained that David, as Emma's father, had the legal right to seek psychological services for his daughter. But the damage was done. Dr. Foster's testimony, combined with David's carefully constructed narrative, painted a picture of a troubled child, caught between a stable father and an emotionally unstable mother. When Jessica took the stand as a character witness for David, describing him as a devoted father who only wanted what was best for Emma, I felt the case slipping away from me. Jessica's testimony was brief but effective. She described David as patient, loving, and deeply concerned about Emma's welfare. "He talks about Emma constantly," she said, looking directly at Judge Martinez. "He shows me pictures of her artwork, tells me about her soccer games, worries about whether she's adjusting well to the separation. He's never said a negative word about Sarah in front of me, even though the situation has been very difficult for him." This last part was laughable, given the text messages I'd seen between them, but there was no way to introduce those messages as evidence without admitting I'd gone through David's phone. Jessica continued, describing a recent incident where Emma had seemed withdrawn during a visit to David's apartment. She kept asking when she was going home, but when David said he'd take her back to her mother's house, she got upset and said that wasn't the home she meant. David was really worried about her emotional state. When it was our turn to present our case, Patricia did her best with what we had. She called my principal, Mrs. Henderson, who testified about my dedication as a teacher and my obvious love for Emma when she visited my classroom. She called our pediatrician, Dr. Williams, who confirmed that Emma showed no signs of abuse or neglect and always seemed happy and well cared for during appointments. My neighbor Carol Stevens testified about seeing Emma and me together regularly, describing us as clearly bonded and affectionate. I see them in the backyard all the time, Carol said. Sarah pushes Emma on the swing set, they plant flowers together, they laugh a lot. Emma runs to Sarah whenever she gets home from school. It's obvious that little girl adores her mother. When I took the stand in my own defense, Patricia guided me through a systematic refutation of David's allegations. I explained the broken plate incident accurately, describing how it had slipped from my soapy hands during cleanup, not been thrown in anger. I provided documentation of my 2 phone calls to David's office, showing they were brief, professional conversations about Emma's school schedule and a parent-teacher conference. Mrs. Mitchell, Patricia asked, have you ever threatened your husband or anyone else? Never, I replied, my voice stronger than I'd expected it to be. I've never been violent toward another person in my entire life. David knows that. He's seen me rescue spiders from our bathtub and drive injured birds to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The idea that I would hurt him or Emma or anyone else is completely false. Patricia had me describe Emma's actual behavior at home, her excitement when I picked her up from school, her insistence on our nightly reading ritual, her habit of climbing into my bed during thunderstorms. I talked about our weekend routines, the art projects we worked on together, the way she still held my hand when we walked through parking lots. Emma is not afraid of me, I said, looking directly at Judge Martinez. She's confused about the divorce, as any child would be, but she's never expressed fear or reluctance about being at home with me. She sleeps peacefully in her own bed, she eats well, she plays with her friends, she does her homework at our kitchen table every night. She's a happy, healthy child who feels secure in her mother's love. But even as I spoke, I could see the skepticism in Judge Martinez's eyes. David's presentation had been first, setting the narrative, and my testimony felt like damage control rather than truth-telling. When Brennan cross-examined me, he was relentless in his attack on my credibility. Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it true that you've been struggling with depression since your separation from Mr. Mitchell? He asked. I hadn't mentioned depression, and I wasn't struggling with clinical depression, but I could see the trap. If I denied it completely, I'd sound like someone in denial about her mental health. If I acknowledged normal sadness about my marriage ending, it would be twisted into evidence of instability. I'm sad about my marriage ending, I said carefully, anyone would be. But I'm not depressed in a clinical sense, and my emotional state has never interfered with my ability to care for Emma. Brennan pressed on, asking about my sleep patterns, my appetite, my social activities, my work performance. Every normal response to a major life change was reframed as a symptom of instability. When he asked about my reaction to discovering David's affair, I tried to be honest while avoiding the trap. I was hurt and angry, I said. I felt betrayed. Those are normal responses to discovering that your spouse has been unfaithful. Angry enough to throw dishes? Brennan asked with a slight smile. I never threw any dishes, I replied firmly. A plate slipped from my hands while I was washing it. That's completely different from throwing something in anger. The hearing lasted 4 hours, though it felt like 4 days. When both sides had presented their evidence and testimony, Judge Martinez called a brief recess to review the documentation. I sat in the hallway feeling hollowed out, emptied of everything except the terrible certainty that I was about to lose my daughter. Patricia tried to be encouraging, pointing out the weaknesses in David's case and the strength of our character witnesses. But I could see in her eyes that she was worried too. Family court judges erred on the side of caution when children's safety was allegedly at stake. Even if Judge Martinez had doubts about David's allegations, she might decide it was better to maintain the temporary custody arrangement until a more thorough investigation could be completed. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Martinez looked grim as she shuffled through her papers. This is a difficult case, she began, involving serious allegations about parental fitness and child welfare. Both parties clearly love their daughter and want what's best for her, but they have presented vastly different versions of recent events. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Judge Martinez continued, outlining the conflicting testimony and the challenge of determining truth from competing narratives. She acknowledged the character witnesses who'd testified on my behalf, but noted the concerning testimony about Emma's alleged anxiety and reluctance to return home. However, she said, and I held my breath, I have significant concerns about several aspects of this case. First, the decision to begin therapy with the minor child, without the knowledge or consent of both parents, raises ethical questions that need to be addressed. Second, the allegations against Mrs. Mitchell, while serious, are not supported by any independent documentation or witnesses outside the immediate family conflict. I felt a tiny spark of hope, though I tried not to let it show on my face. Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Most importantly, she continued, I've reviewed Mrs. Mitchell's background extensively. She has no history of violence, no prior involvement with Child Protective Services, no documented mental health issues that would impair her parenting ability. She has a stable employment history, strong community ties, and multiple witnesses who attest to her loving relationship with her daughter. The spark of hope grew brighter, but I forced myself to remain still and listen. Therefore, Judge Martinez said, I'm denying the petition for permanent custody modification. However, I am maintaining the temporary custody arrangement for 1 additional week, while I order a thorough investigation by a court-appointed guardian ad litem. Miss Emma Mitchell will remain with her father during this period, but Mrs. Mitchell is granted supervised visitation every other day for 2 hours. It wasn't the complete victory I'd hoped for, but it wasn't the total defeat I'd feared either. Emma would stay with David for another week, but I wouldn't lose her permanently, and the supervised visitation meant I'd be able to see her and demonstrate that I wasn't the danger David had portrayed me to be. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave the courtroom, I caught David's eye for the first time that day. He looked surprised, possibly even concerned, as if this wasn't the outcome he'd expected. Jessica whispered something in his ear, and his expression hardened into the cold mask I'd become familiar with over the past few months. Outside the courthouse, Patricia explained what the guardian ad litem investigation would involve. It's basically a neutral third party who will interview both you and David, observe Emma in both households, and make a recommendation to the court about custody arrangements, she said. This is actually good news, Sarah. It means Judge Martinez isn't convinced by David's allegations, and she wants an independent evaluation of the situation. I nodded, feeling exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The battle wasn't over, but I'd survived the first major assault on my fitness as a mother. Now I had a week to prove that David's picture of me was a fabrication designed to win custody rather than protect Emma. That evening, I had my first supervised visit with Emma at a family services center downtown. The room was cheerful but clinical, filled with toys and games, but monitored by a social worker who took notes on our interactions. Emma ran to me when I arrived, wrapping her arms around my waist and holding on tight. Mommy, I missed you so much, she said, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. We spent 2 hours reading books, working on a puzzle, and talking about her week at David's apartment. She seemed happy but slightly subdued, asking several times when she could come home. Soon, sweetheart, I told her, though I wasn't sure if that was true. We just have some grown-up things to figure out first. As I tucked her into the child-sized bed in the corner of the visitation room for a pretend nap, part of our usual routine that she'd insisted on recreating even in this strange environment, Emma whispered, Mommy, did I do something wrong? Is that why I can't sleep in my real bed? My heart broke a little more. Oh honey, no, you didn't do anything wrong at all. This is just temporary, while some adults work out some problems. But no matter what happens, I love you more than anything in the world, and that will never change. The social worker, Mrs. Chen, seemed genuinely moved by our interaction. After Emma left with David, she commented that we clearly had a strong bond, and that Emma showed no signs of fear or anxiety around me. It was a small victory, but I'd take any positive evaluation I could get. Over the next week, I prepared for the guardian ad litem investigation like I was studying for the most important exam of my life. I organized Emma's room to show her artwork, her reading progress, the evidence of a child who felt loved and secure in her home environment. I gathered additional character references from Emma's teacher, her soccer coach, parents of her friends who could testify to our close relationship. But I also did something else, something Patricia had advised against but that I felt compelled to do anyway. I started investigating David's claims more systematically, looking for inconsistencies or evidence that might expose his allegations as the fabrications I knew they were. If he could build a case against me using twisted versions of the truth, maybe I could build a case against him using actual facts. The Guardian ad litem, a woman named Susan Rodriguez, interviewed me 3 days after the hearing. She was professional but warm, asking detailed questions about Emma's routines, her emotional state, our relationship, and my plans for the future. I answered honestly, providing specific examples of Emma's happiness and security at home, her academic progress, her friendships and activities. "Mrs. Mitchell," Susan said near the end of our conversation, "I have to ask directly about the allegations your husband has made. Have you ever been physically violent toward him or anyone else?" "Never," I replied without hesitation. "I've never hit another person in my life. I don't yell at Emma. I don't use physical punishment. I don't even raise my voice very often. The broken plate David mentioned was an accident during dishwashing, nothing more." Susan nodded and made notes. "And the phone calls to his office?" I explained the 2 calls, their brief duration, their professional nature. I offered to provide phone records that would show the actual frequency and length of my calls to David's workplace. Susan seemed satisfied with my explanations, and moved on to questions about Emma's typical day, our evening routines, her friends and activities. The interview with Emma took place the next day, and Susan let me know it had gone well. "She's a bright, articulate child, who clearly loves both her parents," Susan told me afterward. She did express some confusion about the current living arrangement, and asked several times when she could go back to her real house, but she showed no signs of fear or anxiety about either parent. I felt cautiously optimistic as we waited for Susan's report, but I also knew that David wasn't likely to accept defeat quietly. He'd invested too much in this narrative to let it crumble without a fight. I was right to be concerned. 3 days before our follow-up hearing, Patricia called with disturbing news. "Sarah, David's attorney has filed additional documentation," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They're claiming that your behavior during supervised visitation has been inappropriate, that you've been coaching Emma to say certain things, and that you've been making disparaging comments about David and Jessica within Emma's hearing." My stomach dropped. "That's completely false. Mrs. Chen was there for every minute of every visit. She can testify that I never said anything inappropriate." "I know," Patricia said, "but they're also claiming that Emma told David you'd asked her to keep secrets about their conversations, that you'd told her not to tell Daddy about certain things you'd discussed. David is painting this as evidence that you're trying to manipulate Emma and turn her against him." I was stunned into silence. Emma and I had talked about normal things during our visits. Her school day, her friends, books we'd read together, plans for future activities when this whole situation was resolved. I'd never asked her to keep secrets or made negative comments about David, despite the temptation to defend myself against his lies. "There's more," Patricia continued reluctantly. "They're requesting that your supervised visits be reduced to once per week, and they want a psychological evaluation ordered for you before any custody modification is considered." The psychological evaluation felt like the final insult, the ultimate suggestion that I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to my own child. But even as anger surged through me, I realized that David had made a mistake. His additional allegations were so far from the truth, so easily disprovable with Mrs. Chen's testimony and the center's documentation, that they might actually work in my favor by demonstrating his willingness to fabricate evidence. "Let them request the psychological evaluation," I told Patricia. "I have nothing to hide, and any competent psychologist will see that I'm not the unstable person David is trying to portray." What I didn't tell Patricia was that I'd been conducting my own investigation into David's claims, and I'd found something that might change everything. Hidden in the metadata of some photos David had submitted as evidence, I'd discovered timestamps that didn't match the dates he'd claimed certain incidents occurred. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in his carefully constructed narrative, and I intended to use it to expose the truth. The second hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and I walked into that courtroom feeling different than I had the week before. I was still terrified of losing Emma, still devastated by David's betrayal, but I was also angry in a way that felt empowering rather than destructive. David had underestimated me, assuming I would crumble under his legal assault. Instead, I was preparing to fight back with everything I had. Walking into Judge Martinez's courtroom for the second time felt like stepping into a trap that I was finally ready to spring myself. I carried a folder containing the evidence I'd spent sleepless nights gathering, metadata analysis that proved David had lied about crucial dates, and something else he never expected me to find: his own emails. The breakthrough had come when I remembered that David used our shared family computer for personal correspondence sometimes, especially when working from home. His email account was still logged in on the desktop I rarely used, buried under months of accumulated files. What I found there made me physically sick, but also gave me the ammunition I needed. Thomas Brennan stood up to address the court, his confidence from the previous hearing intact. "Your Honor, we have additional evidence that Mrs. Mitchell has been engaging in manipulative behavior during her supervised visits with Emma. We request that visitation be further restricted until she undergoes comprehensive psychological evaluation." Judge Martinez looked skeptical. "Mr. Brennan, these are serious additional allegations. I hope you have substantial evidence to support them." She turned to the court reporter. "Let's have Mrs. Chen from Family Services testify about her observations during the supervised visits." Mrs. Chen took the stand and systematically destroyed David's latest fabrications. "Your Honor, I've supervised 4 visits between Mrs. Mitchell and Emma. During each visit, Mrs. Mitchell's behavior was appropriate, loving, and entirely focused on Emma's well-being. She never made disparaging comments about the child's father or anyone else. She never asked Emma to keep secrets. Their interactions were natural and affectionate." Brennan tried to shake her testimony. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it possible that Mrs. Mitchell could have communicated inappropriate messages to Emma through subtle means that you might not have detected?" Mrs. Chen's response was firm. "Mr. Brennan, I've been supervising family visits for 12 years. I know what manipulation looks like, and I know what genuine parental love looks like. What I observed was a mother and daughter who clearly adore each other and have a healthy, secure relationship. When Patricia called me to the stand, I felt calmer than I had in weeks." "Mrs. Mitchell," she began, "have you made any disparaging comments about your husband or Miss Chen during your visits with Emma?" "Absolutely not," I replied. "Emma asks normal questions about when she can come home and why things are different now, and I answer as honestly as I can while protecting her from adult problems. I've never said anything negative about her father because that wouldn't be appropriate or helpful for Emma." Patricia nodded and moved to our prepared bombshell. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've had an opportunity to review some of the evidence presented against you in the previous hearing. Did you discover any discrepancies?" My heart was pounding, but my voice stayed steady. "Yes. Several of the photographs Mr. Mitchell submitted as evidence of my alleged erratic behavior were taken on dates that don't match his testimony. According to the metadata, the photo he claimed showed me confronting him angrily at Emma's soccer game was actually taken 2 weeks before our separation, when we were still living together and attending Emma's games as a family." I watched David's face go pale as Patricia introduced the technical evidence I'd gathered. The timestamps didn't lie, and they revealed a pattern of David backdating incidents to fit his narrative of post-separation instability. But the real revelation came when Patricia asked her next question. "Mrs. Mitchell, during your investigation of these discrepancies, did you discover any other relevant information?" I took a deep breath. "Yes. I found email correspondence between my husband and Miss Chen that shows this entire situation was planned in advance." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Patricia approached the bench with printed emails I'd found on our family computer. Judge Martinez reviewed the emails with a deepening frown. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to allow this evidence, but I want both parties to approach the bench immediately." During the sidebar conversation, I could see Brennan's increasingly frantic gestures and David's face growing redder. When they returned to their seats, Judge Martinez's expression was thunderous. "Mrs. Mitchell, please read the email dated August 15th for the court," Patricia instructed, handing me the printed page. My voice was clear as I read David's own words back to him. "Jessica, the custody modification is our best option for getting this resolved quickly. If Sarah appears unstable and unable to care for Emma properly, we can expedite the divorce settlement and move forward with our plans. The therapy sessions with Dr. Foster are going well. Emma is confused enough about the separation that her responses can be interpreted as anxiety about her mother rather than normal adjustment issues. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I continued reading. I've documented several incidents that can be presented as evidence of Sarah's instability. The key is timing and presentation. Once I file the restraining order, everything else will fall into place. Sarah won't know what hit her, and by the time she figures out how to respond, Emma will be settled with us and the court will be reluctant to disrupt her routine again. Judge Martinez's voice cut through the stunned silence. Mr. Mitchell, do you deny sending this email? David's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but David seemed frozen, unable to respond. Finally, Brennan stood up. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to confer with our client. Denied, Judge Martinez snapped. Mr. Mitchell, I asked you a direct question. Do you deny sending this email discussing your plan to falsely portray your wife as unstable in order to gain custody of your daughter? David's voice was barely audible. No, Your Honor. I don't deny it. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Patricia continued presenting the emails, each one more damning than the last. Messages discussing how to coach Emma's responses during therapy sessions. Conversations about which lies would be most believable in court. Plans to restrict my access to Emma gradually, until I had no parental rights at all. The most devastating email was the one where David described me to Jessica. Sarah has always been too trusting, too focused on being the perfect mother, to see what's really happening. She'll be so busy trying to prove she's not the monster I'm painting her as that she won't think to go on the offensive. By the time she realizes what we've done, it'll be too late to fight back effectively. Judge Martinez called Dr. Foster back to the stand. Dr. Foster, were you aware that Mr. Mitchell was coaching the child's responses during your therapy sessions? Dr. Foster looked genuinely shocked. No, Your Honor. If I had known that Mr. Mitchell was influencing Emma's statements, I would never have provided testimony based on those sessions. That would be a complete violation of therapeutic ethics. The hearing that I'd entered feeling like a defendant had transformed into David's trial. Judge Martinez questioned him directly about each fabricated allegation, forcing him to admit that the broken plate was indeed an accident, that my calls to his office were legitimate co-parenting communications, that Emma had never expressed fear of me or reluctance to come home. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Martinez said, her voice cold with controlled anger. You are an officer of the court. You took an oath to uphold justice and truth. Instead, you have used your legal knowledge to manipulate the family court system, file false allegations against your wife, and attempt to alienate your daughter from her mother. This is not only reprehensible personal behavior, it is a violation of your professional ethics that I will be reporting to the State Bar Association. She turned to Jessica, who had been sitting frozen throughout the testimony. Chen, you were complicit in a scheme to defraud the court and harm a child's relationship with her mother. While you may not face the same professional consequences as Mr. Mitchell, your actions show a callous disregard for Emma's well-being that will be noted in my final custody determination. The final blow came when Judge Martinez announced her decision. I am immediately reversing the temporary custody order. Emma Mitchell will be returned to her mother's primary custody today. Mr. Mitchell's visitation will be supervised until he completes court-mandated counseling and demonstrates that he can put his daughter's interests above his own manipulative agenda. She wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering Mr. Mitchell to pay all legal fees associated with defending against his fraudulent allegations. The restraining order is dissolved immediately, and I am considering whether criminal charges for perjury and filing false reports should be referred to the district attorney's office. David's carefully constructed case collapsed like a house of cards. As we left the courtroom, I felt a complex mix of vindication, exhaustion, and sadness. I had won, but the victory felt hollow because of what it revealed about the man I'd once loved enough to marry and have a child with. Emma ran into my arms when David brought her to my house that evening, her face bright with relief and joy. "Mommy, I can sleep in my real bed tonight," she exclaimed, and I held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling like I could finally breathe again myself. Over the following weeks, the full consequences of David's actions became clear. The State Bar Association launched an investigation that resulted in his suspension from practice pending a full disciplinary hearing. Morrison and Associates quietly asked him to resign rather than face termination for bringing the firm into disrepute. Jessica lost her paralegal position and found herself unemployable at most law firms in the area once word of her involvement spread through the legal community. Emma adjusted quickly to being home permanently, though she sometimes asked difficult questions about why Daddy had told lies about Mommy. I answered as honestly as I could while protecting her from the uglier details, focusing on reassuring her that both her parents loved her, even though Daddy had made some very bad choices. The psychological evaluation that David had demanded I undergo was completed voluntarily, and it confirmed what everyone who actually knew me had always known: I was a stable, loving mother with no signs of mental illness or propensity for violence. The psychologist noted in her report that Emma showed no signs of trauma or fear related to her relationship with me, but did express some anxiety about her father's recent behavior and the disruption to her routine. Patricia helped me file a countersuit for defamation and emotional distress, and David's insurance company quickly settled rather than face a trial where his emails would be presented as evidence. The settlement money went into Emma's college fund, a small positive outcome from a terrible situation. 6 months later, Emma and I have built a new normal that feels more authentic than anything I experienced during my marriage to David. We have pancakes every Saturday morning, read books together every night, and talk openly about feelings and problems instead of pretending everything is perfect. Emma sees David every other weekend under supervised visitation, and slowly, carefully, they're rebuilding a relationship based on honesty rather than manipulation. I've returned to full-time teaching and discovered that surviving David's assault on my character has made me stronger and more confident than I ever was as his wife. My students' parents, who initially whispered about the custody battle, now see me as someone who fought for her child and won. Several women have approached me privately to share their own stories of emotional manipulation and legal abuse, finding strength in my refusal to be destroyed by false allegations. The most unexpected outcome has been my relationship with Mrs. Chen, the social worker who supervised our visits. She left family services to start a nonprofit organization focused on helping parents navigate false abuse allegations, and she asked me to serve on her advisory board. Turning my nightmare into a way to help other families felt like the best kind of justice. David occasionally sends emails requesting changes to the visitation schedule or asking about Emma's school events, and they're always polite and professional now. The arrogant man who thought he could manipulate the legal system to get what he wanted has been replaced by someone who understands that his actions have consequences. Whether that change is genuine or simply strategic, I no longer care. He's no longer the center of my story. Emma is thriving in ways that prove how wrong David was about everything. She's confident, happy, secure in the knowledge that her mother fought for her when it mattered most. She knows that truth eventually wins over lies, that justice sometimes takes time but is worth fighting for, and that real love doesn't try to destroy people to get what it wants. Looking back, I realize that David's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating my ability to fight back. It was believing his own lies for so long that he forgot other people might still recognize the truth. He thought he could rewrite our history, reshape my character, and reconstruct Emma's memories to fit his narrative. Instead, he destroyed his own credibility so thoroughly that no one will ever trust his version of events again. The restraining order that was supposed to protect him from my alleged violence now feels like a bitter joke. The real danger was never my anger or instability. It was his willingness to sacrifice his daughter's well-being and his ex-wife's reputation to make his new relationship more convenient. That kind of calculated cruelty is far more frightening than any momentary loss of temper could ever be. Emma and I are living proof that sometimes the system works, that truth can overcome lies, and that love is stronger than manipulation. We survived David's attempt to destroy our family, and we emerged more bonded and resilient than ever. Some nights, when I tuck Emma into her own bed in her own room, I remember the terror I felt at the possibility of losing her forever. Now that fear feels like a distant nightmare, overpowered by the reality of our daily life together. The woman who answered her door to receive divorce papers that morning feels like a stranger to me now. That woman was unprepared for battle, trusting in fairness and truth to protect her. The woman I became had to learn to fight for what mattered most, to document everything, to never again assume that love and good intentions would be enough. It's not the transformation I would have chosen, but it's the one that saved my daughter and myself from a man who proved capable of unimaginable betrayal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.